Unit 1, Political Systems, Regimes, and Governments. Topic 1.1, The Practice of Political Scientist. This video is for educational purposes only and is aligned with the AP Comparative Government and Politics curriculum. After this video, you will be able to describe why we study comparative politics and government, contrast empirical and normative statements, contrast causation and correlation, identify and define 3 of the many empirical data collection tools used by comparative government politics. International relations versus comparative politics. So when I was in school, I studied in college international relations, and it is different than what we do in this course. International relations is very much centered on how countries interact with each other, how they trade, what causes them to get into a war, what motivates them to engage in diplomacy. It talks about more of the role of international organizations like the UN, NATO, international trade agreements. What we do in this class is focus more on looking at a country's electoral systems, their party systems, separation of powers and checks and balances between their executive and legislative branches. We look at how interest groups function and how citizens in the civil society are able to participate in that country's political system. There is some overlap between the two. We do talk about revolutions, coups, reforms. We talk about political economics, which is what my master's is in. So I will definitely be excited to do Unit 5 and environmental politics. Okay. Why study comparative politics? Okay, this is a very old meme of Nate Silver, who runs 538. And if you were in my class for US, you definitely are familiar with 538, hopefully. Then, of course, studying political scientist. I don't know if I'm a lawyer, politician, or just an economist. I feel that. So look, the US is pretty awesome, but we don't have all the answers. And sometimes it's necessary to look for other countries to find solutions to some of our problems. We can also really appreciate our freedoms if we compare our situation to what's going on in more oppressive regimes. So it makes it easier for us to look at ourselves, identify our problems, evaluate and understand how countries attempt to solve problems that are very similar to the ones that we are having. And then we can come up and develop a solution to the problems based on what we've seen work in other countries. We're pretty awesome, but we're not perfect. And there's nothing wrong with identifying that idea. So we need to understand the difference between an empirical statement and a normative statement. And this is a map of GDP per purchase power parity per capita from 2014. So it's an older map, but we're going to make some empirical and normative statements based on this map. So the greener the country is, the higher the GDP per capita is in that country. The redder the country is, the lower the GDP per capita is in the country. So looking at the countries we study, there's Mexico, the UK, Nigeria. Okay, we have Iran, we have Russia, and China. All right, so those are our countries that we study for comparative government. So just to give you a sense of where we are in the globe. So an empirical statement is going to be one that is seeped in facts. Okay, it's all about facts that you can measure the fact with data from charts and graphs. You're telling us the truth, okay? You're not putting any kind of judgment on your statement. You're just saying the U.S. has a GDP per capita of $54,000 per person. Okay, that's a fact. And that's not a judgment. You could say that you can even make a comparison empirical statement by saying the United States GDP is very per capita is very similar to Australia's, or Brazil's per capita income is very similar to Mexico's. Okay, That's empirical. Back it with data. Normative statements are those value or opinion statements when you're putting your judgment on it. Like, this is what should happen with the actual data that we know. So you could say African nations should look at European economic development strategies to get themselves up out of the red zone. Because look, there's a concentration of, higher GDP per capita up here in Europe. If Africa wants to see this, they should follow or mimic what Europe does. Now, you're like, well, that might be a fact, but the thing is that what worked for Europe might not work for Africa. So that's what makes it a value statement. You're saying that, in my opinion, what Europe did to become developed could work everywhere in the world. But there's a lot of different things that are playing out in Africa that wouldn't necessarily allow those countries to mimic what Europe is doing. So that's what makes it a normative statement. Okay, another thing that we have to recognize is the difference between causation and correlation. Causation, please note that there is the word cause in here, right? So one thing causes another. Okay, one set of facts / data is caused by another. It's testable, it's backed by proof. So foreign investment in a country boosts the economic growth in that country. Okay, so economic growth in a country, growth is the dependent variable that is going to change because of the independent variable of investments. So if Apple comes into your country and invests in infrastructure and factories, your country's GDP is going to grow. Correlation is kind of an assumption. All right, one set of facts / data relates to another, but we can't necessarily do the through line and prove that one thing is caused by the other. It's all about assumptions. So example is eating too much junk food causes you to be overweight. Well, you're assuming that. You don't know how much somebody exercises. You don't know what their metabolism is like. You cannot necessarily make that through line direct connection. You're making the assumption based on things that we have seen, but every individual is different, right? I just threw a pun in there for you. All right, so the assumption is that junk food causes you to be overweight. But wait, a lot of high schoolers are skinny, and y'all have the tendency to eat a lot of crap. All right, so that really isn't a direct correlation, right? I mean, it's not a causation, it's just a correlation. Tends to lead to something. So this little cartoon, correlation does not imply causation. The Wii remote, if you remember Wii's from the 2000s, the aughts, the kid threw the remote into the TV. That's an assumption. We don't really know because we didn't see it happen. And his sister really isn't going to say anything. Okay. But this work of political scientists is key to understanding how we roll with comparative government. You need to be familiar with data collection resources in order to make empirical statements. So we're going to go through some that you really need to be familiar with for the AP exam in comparative. HDI. Human Development Index measures life expectancy, education levels, and per capita income. Per capita income is when you divide the GDP of a country by how many people they have. So per capita is per head. All right, so if you look here is some per capita incomes for Great Britain. So all of the countries that we study. Take a second to peruse those. Gross domestic product is the total value of goods and services provided in a country divided by the person. So that goes to the per capita income that relates. So GDP per capita is highest in Great Britain and is lowest in Nigeria. That's an empirical statement. A normative statement would be Nigeria should do what Great Britain did to become developed. Or, Russia has smarter economists than Iran. That would be a normative statement. An empirical statement would be Russia's GDP per capita is approximately $6,000 more $7,000 more per person than Iran. Okay, GDP growth rate measures how fast an economy is growing. You want a growth rate of about 2 to 3%. Gini index, or the coefficient, is it measures income inequality. So the higher the index number, the greater the inequality in your country. So you want it to be low. An empirical statement would be that the inequality in Mexico is the same as inequality in Nigeria, and that Great Britain has the best level of equality between, the best level of middle class of all of the countries that we study, the least amount of inequality. Freedom House measures, we're going to talk a lot about Freedom House measures when we get to legitimacy and talking about legitimacy, but it measures the health of a country's democracy. Of the country's democracy. I don't know why I did that, but anyway. So Freedom House rankings, the higher your number, the worse off your country is. The lower your number, the better off your country is in this chart. And then transparency, this measures how corrupt the government is perceived to be. And I will show you a transparency index map when we get to factors that undermine legitimacy in a country. And then the failed state index, again, we'll also see a failed state index map when we get to the topic on how legitimate and stable regimes are. Okay, so that is it for topic 1.1.